didn't really know, but I thought there's something not quite right about this.
So to what extent, in retrospect, do you think that Western news organizations were taking their cues from Western businesses or Western governments?
I mean, 90%, 95%.
Really?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you go back and look at the coverage of, the New York Times, the Washington Post, some other organizations, the current Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, was sort of a colleague at the time. She was part of that whole crew of Western journalists there.
What was she like?
Well, they were all doing kind of the same thing. Like the basic line was that there was a new group of robber baron capitalists who had appeared. And yes, it was messy. It was a messy transition to capitalism was the word they used for it. Now, actually, it was just pure gangsterism. And most of the people who got rich did so through absolutely corrupt privatization schemes where, like, for instance, there was a thing called loans for shares where the government was literally lending the money to cronies so that they could buy companies like Exxon for pennies on the dollar. I mean, like Yukos, for instance, was a gigantic oil company worth, as much as any Western oil company would be worth. They bought it for nothing, basically, for a pittance, because they were pals of the people in government. So they created an instant billionaire class, and that was completely passed over. Nobody reported on that. Then once these people had money, they were treated as sort of legitimate wealth creators and,
entrepreneurs.
Yeah, exactly. They weren't even the robber barons who at least like built railroads.
Oh, exactly.
Stuff, right? Like these guys didn't do anything except steal. They were wealth extractors, and it was amazing watching the hype of these figures, the whitewashing of Yeltsin's complete misrule, his his brutalizing of domestic journalists, right? I mean, like there was a ton of that going on in the 90s, long before Putin came to office and became infamous from it. Yes, there were so many journalists who were killed before Putin came along. Under Yeltsin, yeah, the guy I mentioned.
Only Putin kills journalists.
No. This started from the very beginning. They were doing this. I mean, that guy I told you about with the exploding briefcase, that was 1994 when that happened. There were a lot. I had a friend. Not exactly a friend, somebody I knew well, Alexander Hinstein, who also worked for a newspaper there. He got thrown in a mental institution in the Yeltsin years. There were all sorts of reporters shot. If you go in and shot, killed, beaten. I had another friend named Leonid Krutakov, who was not only fired every time he did an expose, but, he would be attacked. He had somebody come through his window one night, if I remember correctly. So it was a dangerous profession before Putin came to office. Now, obviously, it went to a new level once he came in, and, there were people I knew who died, right? In the years after he became president. But it wasn't an appreciably different vibe for journalists. The difference was that Putin concentrated government authority in a way that had not been done previously. Before, it was more of like a gangland free-for-all. Putin came in, he took over the last remaining independent television station, NTV. He had one of the oligarchs arrested, Vladimir Gusinsky, and the owner of Bank Menatep, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, famously put in jail. They were sponsors of media as well. So, but the only thing that was different is that the government was exerting sort of overt control over media, and they were stamping out the individual pockets of opposition. So during the Yeltsin years, it was very dangerous. You did still have some freedom to do really good work, and that's why those people were amazing. Like, they were risking everything every time they did a story, and they were still doing it. They had such balls. It was incredible to watch.
It's just interesting.
And then the contrast, by the way, between that and the Americans, right, was just so striking for me.
But why would American journalists be providing cover for Yeltsin or ignoring the downside of Yeltsin?
So some of it was cultural, you come in, you don't speak the language. It's a temporary assignment. You're hanging around with a bunch of other Westerners. And so you don't see, right? Like that was a very typical thing. The few reporters who, spoke the language or married Russian women, right? Or were Russian men, they were better, right? Because they were at least in tune to what was going on in the country. But Moscow was still, and St. Petersburg were like a different country compared to what was going on in the rest of Russia. You could be in Moscow and it would seem like a more or less functional place. You go 40 miles outside the city, and again, there's subsistence farming, and or there's whole stretches where there's no government and people are just setting up toll roads. They're putting on camo fatigues and creating their own toll booths.
So it's like Beirut.
Yeah, exactly. But if you didn't go out, you wouldn't see it, So I think it was a problem of perception for a lot of these folks. And, but I thought it was inexcusable because, as a reporter, your first job is to find out, to check for yourself. And
how were you treated by government there?
So we had a unique position because we were publishing in Russia. So unlike all those other American reporters, I was technically a Russian news organization. We had a Russian newspaper. We had a Russian business, right? So even though we were in English, we were regulated by, the Russian government. We got visited every now and then by the tax police asking for bribes. And then after I left, they eventually shut the paper down. But they, they paid attention to us, but it wasn't the same as the way they paid attention to, the New York Times and other reporters. I mean, there were people who were Paul Klebnikov. You remember that name?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he got shot, right? While he was there. And I don't know that it was a Russian government interest that did that, but they were paying attention to coverage that went out overseas. They didn't care so much about what I was doing, which was writing for people who were in Russia. And, and also we were writing in English. So God knows how many Russian officials were even understanding what we were doing. So, yeah.
So how did, well, first of all, why'd you leave?
Well, it became harder and harder. The expat community shrank when Putin came to power, which killed our advertiser base. We had a humor newspaper that was sort of loosely based on like a cross between Spy Magazine and Screw. And I kind of thought that we had, run the course creatively while I was there. At some point I just wanted to come home, but also, it had kind of turned nasty. Some of the people who I knew, I vaguely knew Anna Politkovskaya, for instance, who got killed while I was there. Yes. And there was another reporter who was sort of a mentor to me, this guy, Yuri Shikachikin, who became a Duma deputy. He died under mysterious circumstances. Some people said it was a poisoned telephone. I mean, who knows, right? But it got kind of unpleasant. The community was just not as big as it had been in the 90s. I mean, Moscow in the late 90s was an incredible scene. It was like Chicago in the 30s. It's very difficult to describe what it was actually like. Gangsters everywhere, bodies, all over the place, people being thrown out of windows. There were terrorist explosions happening all the time. It was a wild place to be. That story kind of ran its course while I was there. And the city started to transform into what you saw when you went.
Yeah, the most functional city I've ever been in.
Yeah, which is it's so amazing for me to hear.
It was certainly shocking for me. So this winter, I'm standing in the kitchen with my dogs and my wife comes in. She's just come back from a long walk and she has this look on her face, this look of tranquility and joy and peace. And I said, what have you been doing? And she said, I was praying. And I said, where? She said, on my walk for an hour and a half. And it turns out she was listening to something I'd never heard of before, which is an app called Hallow. Hallow, Halllow, Hallow, like hallowed. And a friend of hers gave it to her. And this set off a chain reaction in my family where pretty much everyone in my family started to listen to Hallow every day. It's a prayer app. And it's the best way, as you know, to find peace. And this makes it very easy to set aside the time to deeply pray every single day. And I was so impressed by Hallow that I tracked down the number of the CEO and I called him and I said, I want to advertise this on our podcast because it's something that I really believe in. And I think you do an amazing job. And it's basically non-denominational Christian. You don't have to be Catholic or Protestant. You can be any kind of Christian. But Hallow will help you focus your prayer in a way that'll be very obvious to your husband when you walk into the kitchen. I can promise you that. It's an amazing, amazing resource. They've got like 10,000 audio guided prayers, meditations, Bible studies. Famously, Mark Wahlberg leads one of them. It's just really, really good. You can download it for 3 months free at hallow.com/Tucker. And I strongly recommend that you do that.